Protesters for and against the Trump administration's ICE crackdown clashed in Minneapolis Saturday as Governor Tim Walz prepared to mobilize his state's National Guard troops to assist local law enforcement. As the Washington Post is reporting, the Pentagon is preparing active duty soldiers for a possible deployment to Minnesota. In a moment, we're going to bring in Deputy Attorney General Todd Blanche. But first, Fox News correspondent Matt Finn is in Minneapolis. Matt.
And Shannon, the Washington Post reports about 1,500 active duty soldiers are prepared to possibly head here to Minnesota if the violence escalates. And yesterday, it was another day of some pretty intense clashes. Unrest showing no signs of slowing down in the Twin Cities. Persistent protesters even lit fires for warmth on a snowy Friday night outside of the ICE detention center. Hours earlier, inside, U.S. Deputy Attorney General Todd Blanche telling immigration agents the DOJ will go after anyone who lays a finger on them.
My marching orders from President Trump all the way on down, Attorney General Bondi all the way on down, is that every single time that happens, we will prosecute.
In a special state address this week, Governor Walz telling people to collect evidence against ICE.
All across Minnesota, people are learning about opportunities, not just to resist, but to help people who are in danger.
The DOJ is now investigating Walz and Fry for possibly impeding immigration enforcement. Mayor Fry says the probe is meant to intimidate him. Governor Walz writing, the only person not being investigated for the shooting of Renee Good is the federal agent who shot her. Outraged Democrats allege DHS agents are racially profiling and violating civil rights.
For the moment, we can certainly block giving additional funding to ICE and CBP.
And Shannon, here in Minnesota, anti-ICE activists have scheduled a statewide day of action for this Friday. They're asking people not to go to work, not to go to school, and not to make purchases. Shannon.
All right, Matt Finn reporting from Minneapolis. Matt, thank you to you and your team there on the ground. And joining us now, Deputy Attorney General Todd Blanche. Thanks for your time this morning.
Good morning.
Okay, so let's start here. I want to play a little bit more of what Congresswoman Jayapal had to say about what she says is actually happening on the ground there in Minneapolis.
We are seeing horrifying videos of ICE agents battering down people's doors without a warrant, racially profiling people on the street, busting in car windows and trying to intimidate and suppress the First Amendment rights to peacefully protest.
So my question is she inaccurate the way she's mischaracterizing? Is she mischaracterizing what's happening there? Or is that actually happening, but the argument is ICE has the authority to do what they're doing?
Yeah, what you just heard was a complete lie. That is absolutely not what's happening on the ground in Minnesota. I was there on Friday. I saw what the men and women of ICE are doing every day, and they are doing their job. And there are folks that may not like that they're doing their job, but these blatant accusations that they're violating the First Amendment or somehow committing crimes are not only completely false, but they're doing real damage to our law enforcement officers around the country. And it's interesting that there are thousands of immigration actions all over this country every single day. And nowhere do you hear this outrage, this made-up outrage from local politicians and activists, except for in Minnesota. And that should be telling to the American people.
So they have, those who are protesting and supporting the protesters took this to court. A federal judge on Friday late ruled that there are a number of things agents cannot do now. Part of what she said is they can't use pepper spray or similar non-lethal munitions on these crowds. She does reference them being engaged in peaceful and unobstructive protest activity. She also says you can't stop or detain drivers or passengers in vehicles where there's no reasonable, articulable suspicion that they're actually obstructing or interfering. She goes on to say, if they're following and tagging and filming ICE, that is not something that is a stoppable issue. So how does this impact operations there, and are you going to appeal that decision?
We're still looking at whether to appeal what that judge did at this point. But I'll tell you, it's absurd for the media and some of these politicians to call what these folks are doing as peaceful protests. They're throwing rocks at ICE officers. They are standing in the roadway where they try to drive by. They're putting their vehicles in the roadway while they try to drive by. So if a judge tells ICE officers not to violate the constitutional rights of protesters, we got it. We're not violating the constitutional rights. But what should be happening, instead of going after ICE officers, what should be happening is local leaders should be sending law enforcement out to stop the protesters from assaulting ICE officers for doing nothing except for their job. And that's the real issue here, is you have men and women who have families going out and doing exactly what they're supposed to do and being screamed at, pushed, assaulted, having rocks thrown at them. We will not tolerate that, and that's been our position from the beginning, and it will remain our position for the rest of this administration.
Okay, so Friday we also learned that the DOJ is reportedly investigating Governor Walz, Mayor Frey there. They have both responded. Here's what we heard from the mayor on Friday. He said, "It's an obvious attempt to intimidate me for standing up for Minneapolis, our local law enforcement, and our residents against the chaos and danger this administration has brought to our streets." He says, "I will not be intimidated." What can you tell us about the investigation and the perception or accusation that you all are weaponizing law enforcement against these folks?
You saw the governor and the mayor actively encouraging criminals to go out on the street and impede ICE. That is not allowed under our law. When a federal officer is out doing their job, they have to be allowed to do their jobs. And the fact that we had to stand up and tell a mayor, that we had to stand up and tell a governor to stop encouraging the folks that are out there running around trying to stop ICE, to stop encouraging them, when what they really should be doing is helping their fellow federal officers, is something that's horrible. But listen, no matter who you are, whether you're a governor, a mayor, or somebody out there on the streets assaulting ICE, you cannot, under federal law, you cannot impede a federal officer doing their job. And that's what we're looking at. And I'm not going to talk about the investigation, but American people can see what the mayor has been saying. They can see what the governor's been saying, and it's obvious that has to stop.
Well, the governor's response referenced a number of things, going after Mark Kelly, he says, Alyssa Slotkin, Jerome Powell. But he also mentioned what Matt Finn mentioned in his reporting there. He says the only person not being investigated for the shooting of Renee Good is the federal agent who shot her. So is the FBI conducting an investigation into that agent, into the shooting? What can you tell us about that? Will it be made public?
Look, what happened on that day has been reviewed by millions and millions of Americans because it was recorded on phones when it happened. Okay. The Department of Justice, our civil rights unit, we don't just go out and investigate every time an officer is forced to defend himself against somebody or putting his life in danger. We never do. That has nothing to do with what happened in Minneapolis. There are over 1,000 shootings every year where law enforcement are put in danger by individuals, and they have to protect themselves, and they have a lawful right to do so. The Department of Justice doesn't just stand up and investigate because some congressman thinks we should, because some governor thinks that we should. We investigate when it's appropriate to investigate, and that is not the case here. It wasn't the case when it happened, and it's not the case today. If circumstances change, and there's something that we do need to investigate around that shooting or any other shooting, we will. But we are not going to bow to pressure from the media, bow to pressure from politicians, and do something that we never do, not under this administration, not under the last administration. And so, no, we are not investigating, and if there comes a time when we need to, we will, but it's not now.
Is there some type of internal review, though, that happens when someone dies at the hands of an agent?
Of course. I mean, every law enforcement agency has their own protocols when an officer is required to defend themselves. Every single law enforcement agency, even the Minnesota Police Department in Minneapolis, and so does DHS, and so does the FBI, and so does every state police department. And so, of course, there's an investigation that's happening, but that's a big difference from what you have the governor insisting that this civil rights unit do and this Department of Justice do, and we are not going to do that.
Okay, let's talk about the Insurrection Act. The president sounds like, he's talked about it possibly being used in a number of situations, and specifically there in Minnesota. It sounds like he's standing down, or at least saying he doesn't think it's necessary at this point. But we've got the Washington Post reporting that some 1,500 active duty troops, the Pentagon's put them on standby potentially to deploy into this situation. No surprise that the Attorney General there in Minnesota, Keith Ellison, has said he'll go straight to court over this if you decide to sue. He also has already filed a separate lawsuit saying this. He says the threats suggest that the federal government is attempting to create a pretext for military deployment by provoking civil unrest. Your response?
Well, President Trump has promised to keep the American people safe. And the fact that the local law enforcement, because their leadership is not doing their jobs, there may come a time when the president has to order that. And we support him. The Attorney General supports him because we have to keep the citizens safe. Now, in cities across this country, in all 50 states, that's done by local law enforcement and leadership. Unfortunately, in Minneapolis, those local law enforcement, who I'm sure are great men and women, are being ordered to stand down. And so when the American people, when the citizens of Minnesota are threatened by what's happening there, you better believe President Trump's going to be there for them. He promised, he campaigned on that. He won the election on that. And if he sees what's happening continue, that's an available tool to make sure that American citizens stay safe.
All right, just to clarify a couple of things. You say local law enforcement's being told to stand down. Is that in response to attacks on ICE? These situations, you're saying the locals are not showing up, they're not controlling the situation? Local
leadership told citizens to call 911 when they see ICE. They did not tell citizens to call 911 when they see ICE officers being assaulted and attacked. And to the contrary, police officers are not anywhere to be seen around the ICE facilities. When the ICE officers are out doing the work they have to do, there are no cops around. And that is not the way that it takes place in cities across this country. In virtually every place we go in, we get support from law enforcement because that's their job. And again, this is not an indictment of the men and women who are police officers in that city. This is an indictment of the leadership that's telling them what to do. And that's why President Trump is looking at all available options and will continue to do so, because the local leadership is not letting local law enforcement do their jobs.
All right, Deputy Attorney General Todd Blanche, thanks for your time today.
Thank you very much.
Hey, it's Will Kane. Click here to subscribe to the Fox News channel on YouTube. It's the best way to get our latest interviews and highlights. And click to subscribe to the Will Kane podcast for full episodes right now.